Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our final Harnessing Technology for the Social Good webinar of the year. I appreciate all the support we've received for this year's series, and I especially want to recognize Gaurav Singha and Amy Frederick for all their organizational work and logistical support that have made this series possible. We plan to continue the series next year, and we do welcome ideas for future talks from our attendees, so please bring them forward. Today is my great pleasure to welcome back to the University of Illinois, at least virtually at any rate, our speaker, Dr. John Gann. Dr. Gant currently serves as Dean and Professor in the School of Library and Information Sciences at North Carolina Central University. The school is the only accredited program in Library and Information Sciences at a historically Black college and university in the US. This opportunity has enabled Dr. Gant to fulfill a personal mission to lead efforts to deepen the capabilities in graduate education at historically Black colleges and universities related to addressing the disparities in the digital transformation in our society and related social impact. Prior to assuming his dean position in 2016, Dr. Gant was a faculty member at the School of Information Sciences here at UIUC. Among his many contributions here was founding and then leading the Center for Digital Inclusion. The center conducted groundbreaking research in the areas of internet access and use, broadband adoption, and new models for delivering digital literacy training globally. Its accomplishments included starting up the Urbana-Champaign Big Broadband, known as UC2B, a University of Illinois-led public-private partnership dedicated to building one of the first municipal gigabit fiber broadband networks in the US. Dr. Gant specialized in information systems while earning his MS and PhD degrees in public policy and management from Carnegie Mellon University, as well as his undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan. I think the warmth that people feel for Dr. Gann here was reflected in an email that I received yesterday from someone who could not attend today, but did want a recording of this talk. It said, I was a doctoral student in community informatics at the iSchool, and after I graduated, I often referenced the Center for Digital Inclusion and Dr. Gant's leadership. Digital inclusion work and measurement in public libraries continues, and efforts are still inspired by the center's work. I know these sentiments are shared by many on our campus and elsewhere. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. John Gann. You're muted, Dr. Gann.
It was a good intro. Yeah, thank you. And I guess a little bit of the bite on my side too. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Dean Anderson, for that awesome introduction. And it's a great pleasure to at least be here through Zoom, on campus in Champaign, although through the internet. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share with you some reflections and thoughts around the digital divide, especially be part of this series around harnessing technology for social good. So in my talk today, it's kind of a high-level talk, and I will bring in a lot of examples and so forth from work that my colleagues and I did at the University of Illinois through the Center for Digital Inclusion. And we'll save plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. And I do want to say hello to the audience. I can't see the list of folks who are there, but I imagine there are some folks that I know from my time when I was in Champaign as well, and just hello to you all also. So as noted, I currently serve as the Dean and Professor of School of Library and Information Sciences at North Carolina Central University. And I'm really proud, to serve in this role. Leaving Illinois was a really big step, and it was very hard to do because I really was so grateful and enjoyed my time at the University of Illinois, and at which was called GISLIS at the time as well. And a long the drive to really want to figure out how we can expand access to information. I figured it was time to start looking at how to do this in graduate education. So my colleagues and I at North Carolina Central are very focused on promoting access to information for everyone, and to do it in a way that really has an impact on the lives throughout our community. And our school is noted also as being, was formed back in 1939, and this was at a time when, especially living in the South, living in North Carolina, where segregation limited opportunities for individuals to come to school to learn about library science. And for me, that was an important call to move to Durham, because it really reflected just some deep-seated values I have, that I feel that access to all knowledge and information should be widely shared as well. And so through our school's history at North Carolina Central, we've evolved to a point where at one time there were many different library science type programs at historically black colleges and universities, and now we're the only one, and we're accredited through the American Library Association. So this is a very important calling for me and what I do now, because I care deeply about the digital divide. I care deeply trying to figure out how do we break down this divide, especially as we continue to adopt and use technology more in such great fashion throughout our lives. It's important to really continue to be really sophisticated in the research, so we can understand the conditions that it takes to eliminate these barriers, and that we can continue to find new innovative ways to make sure people have access to all the tools, knowledge, and information and so forth that we need. But look, when we look at these numbers, it's sobering. And the pandemic actually revealed a lot of vulnerabilities, revealed a lot of shortfalls that we're experiencing here in the US. But when you look at some of the census data, and I just grabbed this from the census website, we still have this divide. We see things are improving, but yet there's still a divide. In terms of number of households that have access to computers, we see that almost 85% of our households have access to computers, and about 80% have access to the internet in 2014. But yet we still see a divide when we break this down by socio-demographic factors into like age, race, and income. And this data here is very consistent. I was actually part of a team that co-authored the very first study that looked at broadband adoption and broke it down by these factors back in 2010 with Nicole Turner-Lee and my colleagues while I was doing a fellowship at the Joint Center for Economic and Political Studies in Washington, D.C. And when we move on and look at this in terms of maps, and folks that know me well know that's how I think about the world, is in terms of space and mapping and that type of thing. But here, we see the differences. Those states that are in green are where we're seeing above average access to households with high-speed internet access, and then purple, below average. And we see the disparities there across our country. And then when we break it down even further and look within metropolitan areas across the United States, similar type of scale, green indicates those areas where households have greater than average high-speed access, and purple less than average. And again, we see these disparities within our metropolitan areas across the United States. And if we were to look at this in rural areas, rural communities, which I also care greatly about, we see a similar type of disparity happening as well. So what's been happening? So in the last 10 years, so while I was at the University of Illinois, during the President Obama's administration, there was a great deal of effort to try and figure out ways of really tackling the digital divide. One of the very first things that happened roughly about 10 years ago was the development of the National Broadband Plan. This was an effort by the Federal Communication Commission, the first ever really, to do a comprehensive review of all the scientific literature that was out there, and also to engage stakeholders from all corners of the United States to provide input and evidence about the need for broadband, the need for greater access to computers, to identify the challenges and the limitations. So this is a very important comprehensive report that was done. And I would urge any of you that have an interest in this type of area to take a look at the National Broadband Plan because of the documentation of the challenges and the issues as well. A lot has happened since then. The plan became the basis for legislation that funded the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program. This is actually the second round of this Technology Opportunity Program. And many of you may know Dr. Kate Williams. She was worked with the first round of the TOP program. But in the second round, the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program was focused on making 3 types of federal funding mechanisms available in 3 different areas. One area was in terms of building new broadband networks, especially to reach in areas that were underserved throughout the United States. The second area was focusing on building opportunities for greater digital literacy training throughout the United States. And the third, to build more public computer centers throughout the United States. So this plan was almost $7 billion, was instrumental as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in really helping to stimulate significant new investment throughout the country to really help break down the digital divide. And many researchers are evaluating its long-term impact and noting that this program helped to create many of the seeds that made it possible that when the pandemic hit, that we were able to see such a high level, a number of people to be able to work from home through the internet as well. And then finally, many of the federal agencies joined the call in response to the need to address the digital divide by developing their own initiatives. So I was part of the Institute of Museum and Library Services agencies, a small agency that invites stakeholders from around the country to focus on developing a roadmap for building digital communities. And what's very powerful about this is that when we look at these strategies aren't simply about let's put more bits and bytes and get people access to computers, but it's really focused on those outcomes. Those outcomes that I imagine that many of you all care about in the social work area, because, in terms of trying to understand how do we feed those that are hungry? How do we clothe those that need clothing? How do we provide shelter for those that are homeless? And those were the stakeholders who were at this meeting, really trying to figure out how do we get the right information, knowledge, computer access at the right place, right time, to really make an impact to improve the lives of those living within our communities across the country. So that was the perspective of this Building Digital Communities program, and it left a big impression on me. But as I look at that time and jump forward now, that researchers are digging in and really trying to understand that in this day and age, why are we still not seeing the impacts from all this computer use that we want to see? Why aren't we really realizing and harnessing all this technology for good in the way we want? So one of our junior faculty from North Carolina Central, Dr. Rizi Agbo, who finished her PhD at Carnegie Mellon as part of her dissertation committee. This is doing some interesting work looking at what we're calling the third level divide. And in this analysis, we're really trying to, she and others and myself are really trying to understand not so much about the challenges for access to computers or what models can we do for training, but this third level, what about how do we get the outcomes that we want to see? So the first level divide really focuses access to computers, access to computer networks, and that type of thing. The second level divide says, what about the activities? What about the training that's necessary? And are people really getting the skills to be comfortable using the computer for everyday life, for whatever needs they may have? But the third level divide is tricky. It's complex because it's not only about the computer technology, access to broadband networks and things like that, having the skills, but it's also about taking all that knowledge and actually realizing those particular outcomes. And so here's something that really jumps out at me. In this work, and I've done a number of studies that are looking at data, and reporting statistics on computer use and what people are doing. We did a really pretty interesting study actually in Urbana-Champaign that I'll tell you a little bit about in a second. But in part of all this work, there's always this key difference that I see that I'm showing here on the screen. We always ask this question: tell us more about how you're using the computer. What types of activities are you doing? And we'll get data, that'll look something like this on the left-hand side. 55% of people saying they're using it to apply for jobs. We see that 80% are using it for looking up information about a product that they're thinking about it. 81% are using for sending and receiving, money online and things like that. So we see the types of things they're doing, and this is data that comes from Arizi's dissertation and a paper that we've co-authored with her. But then we look on the other side and say, okay, you're doing these activities, but what about the outcome? So if I'm spending time looking for a job, I've got a good computer, a good network, and I'm using the services to try and find a job, we're seeing 55% are doing that, but we're seeing only 25% are actually getting a job offer. We see people, 49% are searching for academic programs, but we see 33% actually realizing it and making it happen. And so the simple question I've always had around this, when I look at this type of analysis, is why is there a gap? Why is there a gap? What else needs to be done to overcome this gap between the activities that we're doing and realizing outcomes that really can make a difference in our particular life? And I call this gap, it's a type of a mismatch in a way, and it identifies what I'm calling a digital mismatch. So in today's talk, I want to tell you more about this digital mismatch and talk about how there are barriers that are driving this type of divide that we're seeing that I call the digital mismatch. So we're going to look at factors that are impeding the acceptance and use of technology. We're going to look at when we try and address these issues at a community level and we bring in together community stakeholders, how do we get everybody all on the same page? What are tools or methods that we can really align stakeholders together to do this? And finally, in the third piece I want to look at is we hear the story about algorithmic bias. There's some really great work that's being done, in this space. And it raises the question I've always had in my work in asking, why are not the services we're developing online that are driven by computers better meeting the needs of the folks we're trying to serve? So we'll dig into that a little bit more. And so let me tell you why I'm talking about this. This is an important issue to me. Growing up, and I'm going to share a little bit about myself, but growing up, my mom and dad are from North Carolina, and they were part of that migration, that great migration from the South to the North. And they both attended North Carolina A&T, a historically black college university in Greensboro, North Carolina. And that's where they met, and they married and moved to Michigan. And their migration is a story where many folks were landing in the auto companies and the steel mills and things like that. Their story is a little bit different because they were part of a wave that moved from schools like A&T in the STEM fields, and they landed in corporate companies. So they were both chemists, and they landed in Midland, Michigan, working with Dow Corning, a major chemical company. So in that experience, though, and when you look back at our family, I note that everybody in my family, there's generations of folks that were teachers or they were social workers of one form or another. And what's interesting is that even though my parents shifted into chemistry, the value of teaching, the values of social work still were part of who they were. So in their profession as chemists, they used the chemistry for good. They use it to make an impact in people's lives. And so they carried that forward. And then part of this move and this diaspora is that you would arrive in these towns and there would be others that would be coming there. And so they created a community and they looked out for each other. And all for the benefit of making the town in which we grew up in stronger and better. And that root has always stayed with me. As my dad began to live with multiple sclerosis, that he used his background in science to say, I'm dealing with a major uncertainty in my life and I need information. So he looked at it like a science problem. I need to get every bit of information so I can understand multiple sclerosis, so I can continue to take care of my family. And so he made it a personal journey to get as much information as he could. But in that spirit of how he grew up with his roots, he didn't just take that knowledge and keep it to himself, he shared it. So we became part of this community of folks throughout the Midwest, of families that had a family member with MS, to share science, knowledge about the medicine and how to cope, how to take care of your family, how to stay, and figure out a way to keep your job and so forth. Another thing I saw with this, as we traveled around and talked to people and met many families and so forth, we hear stories about this mismatch that would happen because someone would say, well, I got to get to the bank. And now with MS, I'm on crutches and so forth. And I got to figure out how do I get to the bank? Then if I can get to the bank, can I actually get in and ambulate into the bank? Or is there a curb or steps or something like that? And then when I get there, am I going to get the respect and the dignity that I need in order to have good service from the bank itself? So this reminded me, and then later on I went to college and I spent time in Detroit and so forth, where you see this spatial mismatch, and it kind of reminded me of the same type of thing. And so then the question I've been asking myself today is, what's happening today? So, I came to my interest in all this in terms of being inspired by my dad. And also, I journeyed as an undergrad through courses in urban planning, urban studies, and economics. But it was really when I got to the computer the computer that changed my life, when I could see the power of that computer and what it really meant. And then finally, one day flipping through a computer magazine, I saw this ad over on the right about meet your new MIS department. And here's a group of kids from the Tenderloin district in San Francisco attending computer classes funded through Apple and others to really teach them all about computers. And this happened at the time I was deciding to go on to graduate school after being a transportation planner in Detroit. And this inspired me to really think about what more should we be doing with computers to really make a difference? And are there other divides that are really separating us from doing it as well? And so, I've been in my professional career, we're really focusing, how do we really build a world where everyone has the power to shape their life? And I really want to understand how computers can really help to be able to do that and give folks the dignity, the inherent dignity that all of us have as well. But we also know that there's some exclusion because of the way our political institutions or economic institutions, social institutions are set up. And so we've got to overcome those things. And I think that when we have those aligned well, we can break down this divide. But when they're not aligned, it's no different than a highway ripping through a city and splitting it up in part. It's no different than having a stair on the way to the bank or the grocery store and so forth. And so that's a big piece what I focus on. So while at Illinois, I worked with my colleagues to create the Center for Digital Inclusion to help answer a lot of these types of questions. And I just want to shout out and say a special thanks to my colleagues that really helped to get this going from the very beginning. And that includes Sharon Irish, Martin Wolski, and then we hired some awesome research assistants, including Julian Chin, and then Kristen Phelps. And then we had another great direct assistant to run the center, also along with Sharon, Laisha Metters. And we worked on projects from the PrairieNet, the first initiation of setting up computer labs and access to the University of Illinois computer networks with the public, and then also for building the broadband network in Champaign, known as UC2B. The center has been very successful. Right before the call, I counted up, there were 9 PhD students that were part of our Information Society program, worked in one form or another for the center. Those folks completed their PhDs. All of them have landed tenure track jobs. 4 of them have completed, earned tenure in the last couple of years. And 3 more are up for tenure this particular year. So I'm assuming that'll work out. So it's made a great impact. And these scholars are going on and they're doing work very much in the spirit of the CDI and around digital inclusion and so forth. But let's dig in a little bit more to really try to understand these barriers. And I will talk about 3. The first one is barriers around the adoption and of technology, the acceptance and use of technology. And I refer to it as acceptance, use versus adoption because I think there's a 2-step process. There's always this process of figuring out what you want to do. And then once you start using the technology, really getting comfortable so it can make a difference. And there's a big time lag in making that happen. So to look at this, one of the things that we did through the Center for Digital Inclusion is that we received a grant from the Provost's office to partner with the University of Illinois Extension Service. Now, this was on the heels of being part of this large federally funded project to build the broadband network. And I'll tell you about that in just a second. But the reason why I'm making this point is that if any of you have worked on NSF grants, NIH grants, and so forth, there's a lot of regulations and red tape you have to get through. And then if you work on a federal, basically a work for hire type of contract to a university, I am telling you, it will turn your hair gray with all the regulations you have to go through. So here comes the Provost's office offering these opportunities to submit proposals to work with the Extension Service. And as I tell everybody, to this very day, it was some of the very best grant money I've ever received because of the flexibility of the dollars to really go to where the needs are in the communities throughout the state of Illinois that we were working with. It gave us great flexibility to develop partnerships throughout campus, from engineering to the School of Business to FAA and others, to all work, and also with the extension professionals there, to work together to create this program we call the Digital Innovation and Leadership Program. And we focus on teaching skills on digital fabrication, digital media production, and big data, and so forth. But in the process, we learned that one of the key things for helping to understand about the acceptance use technology is we've got to figure out how to develop the training programs to meet people where they are. I mean, literally, in a spatial sense, to different parts of the state. Extension was amazing to work with because they are embedded. They don't just say we work in the counties, they are embedded. They know the folks throughout the county and the folks that work at the school districts, community anchor institutions, the social workers and so forth. We're all part of our team offering these training programs that we put on wheels. We made them portable, mobile, and we would go throughout the state and provide the latest training with tools like from the fabrication lab, the latest that's happening in big data, the latest that was happening in digital media production. And it was amazing. And then we also developed models to try and figure out how do we bridge those divides within the communities. One important model was we were always trying to figure out who are the right partners to bring together when we want to do the training. So school districts were important, folks from the social work community were extremely important, and so forth. But the family itself was important. So we started developing models to get the family involved with the training. And so it really helped to train not only the young people that are going through the training, but the parents too. And it paid large dividends because, as you know, schools, they don't send notes home anymore, they email it and so forth through proprietary systems. And this was a way to really help break down those barriers. And there was a lot that we learned about it. But probably one of the key lessons about there was the notion of empathic design. So one of our faculty colleagues helped to bring this central into our work. So Deanna really helped us to think about ways that when we're building systems, they can really help people in a way that really dignifies them and doesn't really hurt them or put them at the end of the technology, but make them part of the system as well. And that was one of the key things we infused throughout the way we taught, is that we wanted our students, whoever they were, whatever walk of life, whatever age they were, to really understand, to put themselves in the shoes of the person that they're building the system for. And that was one of the things that really stood out in how we were successful in doing that. A second barrier is that when we think about these kinds of projects, we were starting off initially with a lot of small projects. And if Martin Wolski's on the call, I hope he is, but Martin is amazing. And whenever there was an opportunity for any type of community-based organization to say, yeah, we need some training around computers and so forth, he would get a team of folks, a team of students. He has a really nice model for training the trainers so that they can go out into communities throughout our state to be able to provide this type of service. We did a lot of work in East St. Louis, and so forth. So those projects were a big part of the portfolio of what we did at the Center for Digital Inclusion. But we came to a point where saying, like what's happening, but how can we scale? How can we scale some of these ideas? And so in doing so, it becomes a different type of question. It's not a question so much about the curriculum. It's a question about, in terms of scaling, it's a question about resources. So it's not only access to the networks, access to computer technology, people to help come in and train and so forth, places to go. How do you do that in a community-wide space? And then how do we do it in a way that brings together all the stakeholders to work together in a hand-in-glove type of fashion? So it's very interesting that if we look in today's time, and if we look in the President Biden's administration, we've got this new infrastructure package that's being debated and worked out and proposed. And in there's a call to expand access to broadband as an infrastructure. But folks are making the case that it should be a social technical type of infrastructure. In other words, a community-based infrastructure that surrounds the broadband network with those community anchor institutions, the social work field, the education field, the private sector, all working hand in glove to provide not only access to the network, but the training and so forth that goes with it as well. So John Horrigan, who's one of the seminal researchers in looking at the digital divide, has come out with a really interesting perspective talking about this community perspective for building this infrastructure that's necessary to really improve our communities. So this is stuff we've been thinking about quite a bit, as a matter of fact. And so when we were part of the team from CDI and working with the university on the planning phase of the building the broadband network, our job was really to go out door to door throughout our entire Urbana-Champaign community and talk to folks and ask them, tell us about your computer use. What are the barriers that you're having? What experience do you want to have if we can connect you to the internet? And so that helped us to identify where the needs are. And UCDB stands out because not only was it one of the first to build this high-speed broadband network that was one of the most advanced in the country, but the most unique thing about it is that this map's a little hard to see, but if you can see those areas that are shaded in yellow, those areas are areas that were, for lack of a better term, redlined in a sense by incumbent providers where the service just wasn't adequate. And there was not really systematic investment in those areas to get those households connected to really reliable high-speed broadband services. So UC2B targeted those areas for those homes to be connected and households to be connected first to the network. The second unique thing was that we also connected all the community anchor institutions throughout our community. There's roughly about 300 or so that were connected. So this were all the churches, faith-based organizations were connected, social service, human service organizations, all the schools, libraries, and then organizations, other organizations that serve families in those yellow zones as well. And then finally, the third unique thing was the creation of this community benefit fund. And this fund was used to help provide money for training. So this was a very instrumental project, and the project eventually was spun off into a nonprofit, and later the private partner that we're working with sold it to another private entity who's now running the network. But there were some key lessons that were learned from this. One of the first lessons is that in order to go further, that we really need better tools for understanding how do we get stakeholders involved. For UC2B, it was a lot of legwork to get the stakeholders there, and we developed a model and an approach for working together, and that worked out well. And it was one of the first times that we saw the university and City of Urbana and City of Champaign work together at that kind of scale as well. But the second thing we learned is that we needed some tools to be able to visualize and understand the stakeholders. So we spun off and did another project with Dodge City, Kansas. And here we worked with Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld. He was formerly Dean of the School of Labor and Employment Relations and professor there, who's developed this really innovative stakeholder mapping approach. So we used it to go into Dodge City and to ask community members about what they want to see in terms of trying to overcome the digital divide. And so we identified over 100 different stakeholders from all walks of life in terms of serving the community. And we invited them to participate in this process where we asked them questions about what their expectations are in terms of being able to contribute resources to eradicate the digital divide. So are you willing to come and be part of coordinating activities? Are you willing to, what are your expectations for providing training? What are your expectations about people having access to important information like medical records and a whole slew of things? And then we also then asked, well, then how adequate are the resources within your community to do these things? This gives us a gap, that mismatch that I'm talking about, because you can see where people have certain expectations, but then they look in the community and say, but wait a second, our resources aren't adequate. Second thing that we did in this process then is that we took all those organizations and we created this Honeycomb Map here. And this shows each cell is basically the response from one of the stakeholders in terms of their feeling about the importance, let's say, around the question of coordinating to support developing solutions to the digital divide. Green means they were highly supportive, and red basically means they were not supportive, and it's kind of a continuum of sorts. So when you quickly look at the map, the graphic on the left, you can see that by and large, the community thinks, yes, it is important to have a good, strong coordination for any type of strategy dealing with the digital divide. There's some folks there that had some reservation as well. And then when we look at the graphic on the right, we see a stark change. We see that the map has a stronger yellow and red hue to it. And instantly, your eye can tell you, like, wait a sec, there are some issues in terms of the extent to which the stakeholders within Dodge City feel that coordination is adequate. And we did a similar type of thing when we look at outcomes. Well, if you agree that providing greater computer access will help people have healthy outcomes, like getting access to medical records and being more informed, let's see where your support is for that. So yeah, people felt that was very important to do. There were some folks that had reservations, and part of the reservation was around privacy. The second reservations were really around literacy. And then adequacy in terms of access. And folks said, look, basically, we don't have adequate access to medical information. Similar type of thing with sharing medical records as well. So, and I just noticed the graphics got switched around, and I apologize for that. But it's a similar type of story where you see that gap. And then also in terms of government services, I use the wizard on PowerPoint. It moves the graphics around, but it's a similar type of story there as well. Important to provide access and training. We don't have the adequate resources. And then you go through this process, and then there's another strategic planning process where you're asking the stakeholders, what are you willing to do? And what are you willing to do to address this? So some of the lessons from this are important. One, it shows just how important it is to be able to visualize this, because we would go in the feedback meetings, put these maps on a screen we're in a large space and show this information. And it really helped drive the conversation. And then you had very specific organizations saying, yes, here's what we want to do, and so forth. It also helped to name and frame the problems within the community much better, and to get to a point of making a decision about how to move forward. So finally, I want to get to the third one. The third issue is that there's always this barrier where we're trying to put these services online in a digital space. And so going back to the spatial mismatch, and this is one that this spatial mismatch hypothesis resonated with me from undergrad, where living in Detroit as a transportation planner, you could see how the highway network in the bus, let's take the bus route, the transit network, was basically drawn on a north-south axis, right? Going from the center city out to the northern suburbs. But as Detroit grew from east to west, the transit lines, bus lines didn't change. So then now you had folks that needed to get jobs that were west of or east of the main transit lines and couldn't get there. That was a classic example of that mismatch. And it had an impact on their earnings and that type of thing. So I think the same thing happens in the digital space. My early work on digital government was on the front lines of trying to understand how to put government services online. And in this process, as you go from simply putting stuff on a website to like what we see now today, where our systems are collecting lots of different data, we're connected to back-end systems and so forth, we can provide full service online. There's a lot of complexity that happens. And we're working in an environment where everything is digital. So our access is from home, we're getting access through the internet. The computer interface is my storefront. It's 24/7 and so forth, right? So that's our experience now. But the thing we have to remember is that somebody somewhere is designing and building this experience for us. There are computer programmers that are building this. So one of the research theories that we use a lot in this work is from Body Freeman around value-centered design, right? It's this notion that the values of the developer become embedded into the software tool. And you can see that, right? And but today, we're seeing that it's known as what is called coded bias, algorithmic bias, and so forth, where we're asking questions about do the folks that are building these applications, do they really understand the user, or are they really reflecting the biases of the folks that are building it? And part of the bias that we're seeing is this notion about trying to use these types of tools to create these experiences that we see online that are very focused on each individual. So in other words, these are based on predictive models. Dr. Zuboff has come out with this really nice book that everybody should take a look at, where she calls it the surveillance economy. Because part of the way these tools are set up is that the business models are such that the gold nugget that we're trying to, that the businesses are trying to capture is your individualized information, data about you. So it can be fed through algorithms and try and predict what you want to do, what you want to buy, and that type of thing. I've done some work in policing where I've seen that model being used to try and predict crime hotspots in major cities. I've worked with social service organizations that were trying to use models of this to try and predict whether or not somebody was eligible for a benefit or whether they were going to default on their eligibility, for that benefit, right? And so then the problem is that we seem to forget is that the computers are doing this, and these predictive models have great names and machine learning and predictive analytics and all this kind of thing. And it sounds like it's accurate. It sounds like it works well. But we forget that the prediction, the predictive ability for most of these tools, they're only right maybe 10 or 15% of the time. So that means they're wrong most of the time. But yet we're relying on these types of tools more and more every day. They're driving our recommendation systems. They're driving so much of what financial decisions and things like that. So there's some real trade-offs there that we've got to really try and resolve. And so what I really think here then is that knowing that we've got these barriers here, this gives us an opportunity to say, what should we think about next? How do we move forward? And so I think there's three things. First, I received a fellowship from the Kettering Foundation, and it's called the Wishington Fellowship. This has been an amazing 2 years of this fellowship because we're looking at really different ways of trying to address little d democracy across the world, participation in civic engagement and decision-making and so forth. And as I think about this, I don't think about this as a computer problem. I think more of a problem about how do we name and frame the issues that we're trying to solve. So if I'm in the field of social work and I'm trying to address some issues within my community, and we're thinking about technology being a solution, I'm often seeing that we're putting the cart before the horse. We're thinking about the technology solution, but we haven't really thought about how do we name and frame the issue. And I think the naming and framing needs to be around one very specific thing. What is the information that we need to have to get at the right place, the right time to really help people live their life, right, with full dignity and so forth? How do we help the vulnerable populations within our community? So I think the questions need to be framed about that information, resolving that uncertainty. Secondly, we've got to leverage together all of our stakeholders. And I know there's a lot of work, especially in social work, on approaches for doing that. I think we need to go to a next step of trying to do a better job of visualizing those relationships and incorporating that into our discussion that will help us to name and frame the problems, help us to figure out how stakeholders can come together. I see so many projects that go forward where there's not a clear vision about where you're trying to get to. And these stakeholder mapping tools, I think, are highly effective ways of trying to do that. And then finally, I think we have to redefine who the system is serving. The one thing I learned in my e-government work is that there's always this tension between the federal or the state or local government agency feeling like they were the driver of the tool versus the citizen they're trying to serve. So we know there are power dynamics that were there that were built into the technology itself. I'll close with this story. I'll never forget this, that in one of the early digital government works that I worked on in Indiana, they built a new web portal. It had some issues, but one of the agencies, the Health and Human Service Agency, rolled out some new web-based services. And as soon as it rolled out, they shut down the brick and mortar service center. And so instantly, folks who were up in arms who needed to get their benefits, who were lost behind the digital divide, couldn't get it. That to me was the classic digital mismatch. And so we got to really, so the folks that were building the system said, well, this is going to save us lots of money. But the folks who need it said, we can't use it. So there's the divide and there's the mismatch right there that needed to be resolved. And so we've got to really define who the system's for, and do it in such a way that really puts the social good of the community first. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you have. We've got some time here for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Gant. What a wonderful talk it was. I have a question from Elise Johnson. I'm Gaurav. You've not seen me earlier.
Yeah. I talked to you over email, but yeah.
So Elise Johnson asked, there are so many nonprofits doing great work in this space, but I have never seen social workers working there. These should be field placement settings. What can the grant challenges do to facilitate social workers in these existing spaces? Grant challenges are an initiative of social work profession. They have 12 lofty goals. So they are asking, what can they do to facilitate social workers in these spaces?
So, I don't know what the specific 12 grant challenges are that are part of your community, but I think about those all the time because that's actually how we frame a big part of the mission of my school, the projects that our students work on, the research that we do as well. So let me give you an example. I think the question is really great because there's so much from social work that is important today, because the way I look at things is not so much about the computer tool, but the experience that you're trying to create for the service that you're trying to provide to meet the grand challenge. So if housing is an issue within the community, it's about the experience for helping people find housing and secure and sustain housing in the long run. And I think when you frame it as an experience versus a technology solution, there's a different mindset. When I frame it as an experience, I'm trying to say, how do I meet the person where they are? How do I understand what their needs are? How do I sit in their shoes? How do I do it so that the service we provide will reaffirm them as a person? And a technologist can't do that. The housing authority can do some of that, but somebody from social work who's in the shoes, who understands the day-to-day life, can get it done. And so that's where you can say, if you can build a team that can be integrative and bring in somebody from social work to help really think about the experience, and then secondly, think about the information that's necessary and how do we be good stewards of that information, we can do it. Another quick example. So a number of libraries are finding, especially public libraries, are finding librarians actually doing a lot of social work type of things. And so we've got a trend in our library science programs around the country where they're looking to form partnerships with social work so so our library students are actually getting that training as well. So even in the local library systems here between Durham and Chapel Hill and Wake County, we've got probably a couple dozen students that have that type of background, and it really pays off large dividends. Because remember, if you're somebody who's coming in, you're trying to figure out, how do I take care, I'm a single mom, trying to take care of my children who've got chronic illness, I've got a lot of uncertainty. And I'll go to the library and ask for information to get help and so forth. And so we're seeing that as being a model that is catching on. And in so much so, the American Library Association is forming a special interest group to help facilitate and accelerate the diffusion of that type of model in libraries. So, I would really recommend trying to find ways of intersecting with other community anchor institutions. And again, organized around creating better experience and the right information to really help people out.
Thank you, Dr. Gant. We have another question from Dr. Anderson. You show spatial examples of how people in disadvantaged communities have limited access to computers, internet.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how these may have been attenuated by the pandemic, and how pre-existing inequalities may have heightened differences in outcomes given the heavy reliance on technology during this period, such as the school outcomes?
Yeah, so I can answer. So I've got some evidence, but not from in school, but in terms of health. So I've been working with two sets of colleagues. One runs a national center for nutrition. The other one runs a national biomedical research center. Both are dealing with health disparities and the digital divide, and that's my collaboration with them. In looking at the maps, it's amazing. So I'm looking at maps in North Carolina. I've got students working on this too. One of the problems when you look at it spatially is that first you assume that urban areas are more connected than rural areas, but in our state in particular, and I know this is true in Illinois, there are pockets within urban areas where the connections just aren't there. Secondly, just even if there are good connections, doesn't mean that necessarily people have the right types of devices, families have the right devices, and thirdly, the right know-how, or the right community relations to go out and get the help that they need when you've got your young child there who's got to be in class the very next day trying to solve a problem. So the spatial thing is, I think, was the pandemic brought out even finer grained examples of where the access to computers and networks was really inadequate. Our university did research in rural areas where there's a lot of vulnerable population. And in our work, in this study was about connectivity for schools, and this was in kind of the eastern part of North Carolina. We were blown away by the number of families that were going to school using their phone. And then another story, my program is predominantly online, and I have students in graduate school that are trying to do graduate school online, you know, with their phone. So it's a hidden problem because I ask people, well, do you have a computer at home? They say, yeah, but I'm so much more comfortable using my phone since I'm on it all the time. That's my preferred way of doing it. Or we have one computer and we have to share it. Or we get on, and when multiple people are on, the bandwidth goes down, and so, you know, we don't have good connectivity and things like that. These are things where our data that we have at the national level and at the state level is not robust enough to pick up those kinds of problems. And so that's the unfortunate part. Our data is, we have what we have, but it's not robust enough to give us good real-time data about this. Now there are folks. So the student who shared a comment at the beginning, he's doing work where he's looking at these speeds within libraries, and they've got tools to actually measure the speeds that are coming in to try and get at this. But this is not these kinds of projects are piecemeal. We're not seeing sort of national data that can give us better information about what's happening on the ground during the pandemic. We've got a lot of folks trying to sort it out. The data is not very good. And but we're working hard to try and understand, what's happened during the pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Gant. We have two more questions, and we have only one left. If you have time, I can ask you those questions.
Okay, I'll give short answers.
Okay, so one is by Ashley Buckley. She is asking, when working with social services, typically it is difficult to pinpoint a specific issue that would need to be solved with automated systems. What are your recommendations when working with vendors to express the process and target?
So this is where the mismatch, I think, comes in a lot. Vendors have the solution they've come up with, and remember the vendor's incentive is scale across the country. Your incentive is to customize to your specific need and your specific community and the folks you're trying to serve. So I really think that you need to invest in try and form a relationship, even contractual relationship, where they can be more of a partner to really come up with solutions that can really meet the needs. I would include an evaluation piece and ask very specific questions. Are you getting the right data and information you need to make those decisions as well? And then finally, in that evaluation, ask the end user, how do you feel about the information that you have to give up in order to get these services, and try and see if there are any issues there that need to be resolved. I guarantee you're going to find some things because, the vendors are in there are going to be gaps. And I think you need to build on a process and use the evaluation to really help you, like a formative evaluation to really help guide, identify those gaps, and then to continuously improve to make things better. So that's the 30-second answer to that question.
Thank you. There's one last question by Dr. Rosalba Hernandez. They are asking, how do we ensure the digital divide doesn't pit different initiatives against each other? For example, technology to deliver mental health services versus those organizing against closing mental health clinics. How do they synergize and work together? Both are seeking social good.
Yeah, so that's one reason why I wanted to share the stakeholder process, because when you look across a community, the multiple organizations need to be working together. So there's a whole mental health community, and they probably have different approaches to trying to solve the problems. And I think you need to really bring everybody together and use kind of these stakeholder approaches to really identify where do we have agreement, where do we have disagreement, and then tackle those places where you have disagreement as well. You want to identify where those conflicts are as well. And part of the conflict is going to be the same community asking the same questions of the same person. I've experienced that personally with a family issue, and and helping with my son, and we going from agency to agency to agency to get help. We learned he has autism, and so we're trying to figure out where to get help. And it was stressful to me because I'm thinking, you guys are asking the same questions, don't you have the same information? In fact, some of your solutions are actually in conflict with each other as well. Can we all get on the same page so that at the end of the day, he can get the help as quickly as possible? So that stakeholder mapping, I think, is an effective way. I'd love to talk more about it because I think there's a lot more that we can talk about to try and resolve that. But it's something that happens very commonly as well. That's another 30-second answer. Sorry, I couldn't elaborate more.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Gant. We really appreciate you being here. Thanks to the audience for sticking with us a few minutes past our time. Dr. Gann obviously has shared a lot of very interesting and provocative ideas with us that we hope we can keep continuing these conversation with him and among our audience in the coming year, because we do plan to continue this, as I said earlier. But for now, have a great day, everyone. And again, John, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And thanks. Good to have the opportunity to speak to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gant.
Good afternoon.
Take care, Dean.